At the beginning of any modelling task lie some very important choices that the modeller must make. Given that we're going to set out to model a specific problem in a specific domain, we have to decide which elements in the domain are going to feature in our model. That is, we have to actually select those features, characteristics of the source domain that we will represent numerically within our model. We have, in other words, to design a representational format for the domain. This is an inevitable task for any modeler. This choice is forced upon us in order to do any modeling at all, and in that respect, we need to distinguish between doing this task and the often vexed debates that surround representational theories of cognition, or the very idea that representation is the right framework to understand cognition. Those philosophical questions exist, and we're close to them all the time. That changes nothing to the fact that as a modeler, if we wish to build a model of a domain, we have to choose to characterize salient, as we see it, elements in that domain within our model. That choice will establish this relationship then between entities in the model and we're going to follow one example in some detail here, and it's a famous example in this second wave of connectionism, and it comes from a network known as NetTalk. We're going to follow both the choices that the modelers made and their consequences for the model. But then we're also going to study the language with which the model was discussed more popularly, because this, as many models in the second wave of connectionism, made some kinds of headlines. NetTalk was developed as part of a larger system in which the performance of the system as a whole was to go from textual representation of the English language to spoken output. Of that broad project, NetTalk occupied only a very small part. Its task was to accept English written text as input and to produce phonemes, or the constituent sounds, as output. These constituent sounds would then be a challenge for a further system, a speech synthesis system, which would turn them into sounds. NetTalk did nothing of that task. Its job was this mapping between orthography and phonology. Now, English is the most disastrous language. I often wonder if we should still call it a language. Contemporary English orthography is the result of a history in which, among other things, English language functioned as the principal vehicle of trade and colonialism in very many parts of the world. And in such situations, languages mix, they acquire characteristics from each other. And the British Empire was the most widespread empire the world has ever known. The result of this is that the English language has a peculiarly diverse set of words, structures within it, and English spelling is an absolute mess. There is no language in the world in which the orthography, the written form, bears such a problematic, complex, and utterly bizarre relationship to pronunciation. Consider the two words caught and laugh, for example. On the left, you can see the written version, C-A-U-G-H-T and L-A-U-G-H. Pronounced, I've used a particular symbolization of phonological form. On the right, caught and laugh each have three distinct constituent sounds or phonemes. So the idea is we want to map from the disaster on the left to the somewhat principled sequence of phonemes on the right. The way it's going to do this we'll try to deal with the fact that there's no sense in asking in English how each letter is pronounced. Many letters can only be understood in context. How is the G in caught or laughed pronounced? Well, the answer is it isn't. It's also not irrelevant. If you leave it out, you don't have an English word. So that each letter considered in sequence only makes sense given its surrounding context. So that what this network is going to do is take a sequence, a sliding window of 7 letters, possibly including spaces and punctuation marks. And it's going to try to interpret the middle one, so 3 before and 3 after. The middle one is what it's going to try to interpret, as shown there, for example, in order to try to understand what sound, if any, to associate with the U in caught. We will the space before the word, the C and the A, the U, of course, and also the following G, H, and T. Now, English spelling being such a disaster, there's not much sense in which we can sensibly ask of 2 spellings how close together they are. One spelling may have a history that goes back to Swahili, and another spelling may have a history that goes back to Irish or Old Norse. It's a very, very unprincipled domain. So the approach taken here doesn't try to impose a metric on the chaos of English spelling. Rather, it will use input units in which 7 times 29 units are arranged. 29 units for each of these 7 places within this window. That is 26 for letters and 3 to handle space and punctuation marks. Only the period and the comma will be accommodated. And the encoding within each of those groups of 29 units will be what we just met, a strictly localist encoding. So there'll be 1 bit, which we will consider corresponds to the letter A. If that bit is on, then it's the letter A in these 29 units. If that bit is off, it's not the letter A in these 29 units. It's a very redundant form of coding. We're using 29 units, and each time only 1 bit is on, and then we're repeating this 7 times in a row to give us a really very large input layer. The choice of a localist encoding is motivated by the lack of any strict regularity within the domain. In this sense, patterns are distinct, they are clearly distinct, and humans can look at them and easily say which pattern they are, but we have no metric patterns. The output domain is more interesting because this is a phonological domain. And here, what we want to do is find an output representation in which similarity relationships are made manifest. So we're going to have to consider the output domain a little bit. Here's a curious little graphic that illustrates the variation in the place of articulation. A consonant, so phonemes or speech sounds can be divided roughly into vowels and consonants. They are very different. Consonants typically feature an obstruction in the airway somewhere between the vocal folds and the lips. There are many points at which we can make such an obstruction, and the consonant arises either from blowing air through a narrow gap at that point, or from stopping the air completely and then releasing it, or by shaping the air through a constriction at that point. So, for example, the sounds p and b, which we associate with the letters P and B, both feature occlusion at the lips. And we can go back and find sounds made at the teeth, just behind the teeth at an area called the alveolar ridge, at the hard palate, at the soft palate, and even at the back of the throat. So the English consonants are arranged there, distinguished by their place of articulation, and that refers to where they are here. and also by their manner of articulation. So looking at the first four, p and b are very, very similar. They're distinguished in that one of them, p, exclusively has its sound coming from this constriction, whereas b in the vocal folds, which we call voicing. So many sounds, many consonantal sounds in every language will exhibit this alteration, p, b, t, d, k, g. Also at the lips, we have sounds that are made with a different manner of articulation. So p and b are stops. M is a labial sound, but it's produced with the velum, or the very back of the palate, lowered so that the air is not completely occluded but comes out through the nose. We call a nasal sound, and in English we have three nasal sounds, m, n, and ma, formed at three different places of articulation. So you can see the systematicity to the organization of consonants. Unlike the disaster that is spelling, there's a systematicity here. And vowels work very, very differently. We'll look at those in a minute as well. So, in the NetTalk network, we have 7 times 29 input units, each group of 29 standing for one letter position. And the goal of the network is to create an output which is a phoneme or zero connected with the middle letter. So here we have, for example, a window in which we have the letter C as our target, and the correct answer will be K. And we will interpret that in the context of space before, A before that, space before that, A after that, T after that, space after that. So this is a much simpler example than caught. So we've got all these 7 times 29 input units feeding into a single hidden layer of 80 hidden units and going to an output layer where we're going to use 26 outputs to encode English phonemes in such a manner that this systematicity that we've just noted will be respected. The way to do this is to make use of our knowledge of the domain, our knowledge of English phonology, or the sounds which are contrastive in English. In most varieties of English, there are about 43 contrasting sounds, some varieties slightly more, some less. And this is a mid-size inventory among human languages. Some languages have quite a few fewer, some have vastly more, but 43 is not atypical among the languages of the world. And we say something is a phoneme if it functions contrastively. An example of how we would know this is if we can find a minimal pair in which the only difference is the one feature with which we use to describe the phonemes. So we mentioned that p and b differ precisely in that the b has an additional feature of voicing. So pat and bat are minimally contrastive in this sense. Notice that the phoneme is itself an abstract notion and is a long way from actual sound. In fact, if we analyze speech and we record someone saying the p at the start of pat, and we record them saying the P sound at the end of cup, what we'll find is that there's two very different sounds there. So phonology is still an abstraction, but it's a systematic abstraction. The orthography, on the other hand, is so messy that we give up on trying to represent its structure. So what's the systematicity that we're going to do? Well, for consonants, we're going to be interested in the voicing as one feature, the manner of articulation, and the place of articulation. Phonology comes with a rich set of features for describing precisely those dimensions along which phonemes contrast. So in this sense, a phoneme can be thought of as just a bunch of features, each of which is either present or absent. One of the most important of these features, and it's going to influence the way we interpret all the rest of them, is the feature whether it's a consonant or a vowel. So each phoneme is going to be classed as either consonantal or vocal. In NetTalk, they had 26 outputs which correspond to 23 articulatory features, Those are the features that describe each phoneme, and 3 more to describe stress and syllable boundaries, which are additional linguistic elements that are important in pronunciation. Underlying this is a body of knowledge. Phonology has a long history. What's shown here is one of its most important and famous outputs, the International Phonetic Alphabet, first developed in the 19th century, which aspires to systematically represent all contrasts, phonemic contrasts, that can arise in all of the world's languages. So this is not supposed to be based on English or any language in particular. Many of these contrasts do exist in English, some of them don't exist in English. And the top half shows the chart for the consonants, while the bottom shows a completely different form of organization for the vowels. I'll just describe that very briefly. The vowels are organized around a 4-sided figure, which represents roughly the highest point of the tongue within the mouth. Different tongue positions result in different vowels. And if a vowel is a steady state vowel, we can describe the position of the tongue as lying basically along 2 axes, one going up and down from top to bottom, and one going from the front of the mouth towards the back. Now, obviously some warping is needed because the mouth is actually a tube, a bent tube, and it's not quite as neat as here, but that's the basic systematic opposition. Furthermore, as well as tongue position, each vowel may be rounded, like oo, or maybe not rounded, like e. English makes use of this contrast very sparingly. Other languages make much greater use of it. So this aspiration, this highly abstract way of looking at the sounds of the world languages, is the starting point of phonology. And in English, we come out with this particular set of consonants. We're not going to dwell much on the vowels. And so now we know what it is that NetTalk is doing. It's taking a localist encoding of the letters for good reason, going through a single hidden unit to produce a phonological representation of the sound, if any, associated with the letter. So make sure that you're clear about why a localist encoding was used at one point and a carefully handcrafted distributed encoding was used at the other. Now you know what NetTalk does. You could, in theory, go out and build one yourself. We brought a great deal of theoretical knowledge to bear in designing these representations. We mined phonological theory to come up with feature-based descriptions. We made use of systematic alternations, contrasts in designing our representations. So that knowledge that phonologists have alerted us to the structure that would be of use in the tasks that we had designed. That particular step of drawing from your own understanding of a domain in order to design representations that are up to the task is very, very important. And those representations cannot in any way be considered as independent of such decisions. This is the point I was getting at the start when I pointed out that even a perspective image involves a lot of this kind of constructive artifice. So the equivalent where the artist here is using a linear grid, keeping monocular static vision and effecting a transfer from square to square, corresponds in its artifice to the phonologist who has studied the messy sounds of language and come to a theoretical conviction that there is underlying this an interesting, far more abstract and systematic way of describing those sounds. You now know so much about NetTalk, but I want you to see how connectionist work is then described in public in order to sensitize you so that you can spot and distinguish bullshit from fact, so that you can have some means of interpreting description of the feats of these networks appropriately. Because at all stages of neural network research, public communication of the science has been a disaster. That continues to be the case today. It's famous enough to have its Wikipedia. And here's the summary. NetTalk is a program that learns to pronounce written English text by being shown text as input and matching phonetic transcriptions for comparison. That is not wrong, but it's also not right. Look at what the word pronounce is doing there. If I read and I see the word Wikipedia and I pronounce it, you mean, we understand what we mean when we say I pronounce a word. NetTalk did no pronunciation, it did sums, right? The sums were over numbers which bore specific correspondence to English text and to phonological representations. Phonological, not phonetic. So this is wrong and quite misleading in some ways, but it's not too bad. Compare that with this article which appeared in the New York Times in 1988, and here we see more of the kind of popular discourse around neural networks. NetTalk, an artificial neural network that can be trained to pronounce English words, consists of neurons arranged in layers which read a word and generate speech sounds. The neurons, which are simulated on a computer, blah, 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 provided with a list of words at the start. It babbles incomprehensibly, but some of its guesses are better than others. It's changed by adjusting the strength of its synapses according to a set of learning rules. After half a day training, the pronunciations become clearer, and NetTalk can recognize some 1,000 words. In a week, it can learn 20,000. Look at these confusions. Notice NetTalk has no brain. There's no neurons. There's no synapses. This is why the term neural network has become a problem. As regards what the network is doing, look how underlying this there's the utterly wrong impression that we have created an artificial human infant. NetTalk doesn't babble. Human infants babble incomprehensibly. But to see a network or unsystematic numbers to systematic numbers, that training to suggest that development is the same as, related, or in any way related to what a child is doing is so wrong, it beggars belief. So, and the same confusion with regards to phonology, phonetics, and spelling is evident throughout here. I think that's an awful lot of confusion for one brief summary, and it's entirely typical of the area. You know everything about NetTalk that there is to know, pretty much. You know everything at least to spot all the horrendous errors in this. So that's a good example of how our knowledge about a domain would push us to choose one form of representation over another. And in this particular case, we had a very strong motivation for choosing a localist representation at the input and a specific kind of distributed representation at the output.